Detective Sarah Martinez had seen it all in her 23 years on the force. Gang violence, domestic disputes, robberies gone wrong. She thought she'd witnessed every kind of evil that humanity could produce, but nothing could have prepared her for what she found that Tuesday morning in March. The call came in at 6:47 a.m. Possible homicide on Elmwood Drive. The dispatcher's voice crackled through her radio. Martinez grabbed her coffee and headed out, expecting another routine case. By noon, she'd be filing paperwork. By evening, she'd be home with her family. She was wrong on both counts. When Martinez arrived at the modest two-story house, she noticed something unsettling in the air. The other officers at the scene weren't talking. They stood in small groups, their faces pale, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Veteran cops who'd seen decades of violence were visibly shaken. "What do we have?" Martinez asked Sergeant Thompson, a 30-year veteran known for his steady nerves. Thompson looked at her with eyes she'd never seen before. "Sarah, I don't even know how to describe this. In all my years, I've never seen anything like it." He paused, swallowing hard. "The brutality? It doesn't make sense. There's no reason for this level of violence." As Martinez approached the house, one question echoed in her mind. Who could commit something this disturbing, and why? To understand the horror of what happened, you first need to know about Margaret Maggie Foster. At 42, Maggie was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel better about the world. She worked as a librarian at the local elementary school, where children would line up just to talk to her during lunch breaks. Maggie lived alone in the house on Elmwood Drive, but she was far from lonely. Her sister called her every morning at 7 sharp. Her neighbors borrowed cups of sugar and stayed for coffee. The mailman, David, always stopped to chat about his grandchildren because Maggie genuinely wanted to know how they were doing. She'd never married, but Maggie had love in abundance. She volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends, fostering cats and dogs until they found forever homes. Her house was filled with photos of her babies, dozens of rescued animals she'd helped over the years. At work, Principal Janet Coleman relied on Maggie for more than just managing the library. She was our unofficial counselor, Coleman would later tell investigators. Kids who were having trouble at home, teachers going through divorces, parents worried about their children. They all went to Maggie first. The week before her death, Maggie had been planning the school's annual book fair. She'd stayed late every evening, arranging displays and organizing volunteer schedules. Her calendar was full of simple pleasures: coffee with her sister on Saturday, a movie with her neighbor Carol on Sunday, and a dental appointment she'd been postponing for months. Nothing in Maggie Foster's quiet, generous life suggested she would become the victim of unspeakable violence. Monday, March 15th, started like any other day for Maggie Foster. She arrived at Roosevelt Elementary at 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes before her shift began. This was her routine. She liked to have coffee and review the day's schedule in the quiet library before the chaos of children filled the halls. At 10:15 a.m., she helped second grader Tommy Martinez find a book about dinosaurs. At noon, she ate lunch with the other teachers, discussing weekend plans and sharing photos from her neighbor's new puppy. At 2:30 p.m., she read to Mrs. Peterson's kindergarten class, doing different voices for each character in Where the Wild Things Are. Everything was perfectly normal. Maggie left work at 4:15 p.m., stopping at the grocery store to pick up ingredients for the lasagna she planned to take to her sister's dinner on Wednesday. Store security cameras captured her browsing the pasta aisle at 4:32 p.m., checking items off a handwritten list. Her last known interaction was with teenage bag boy Marcus Johnson, who helped carry her groceries to the car. "She asked about my college applications," Marcus remembered. "Said she'd write me a recommendation letter if I needed one. She was always doing stuff like that for people." Maggie's car was seen turning onto Elmwood Drive at 5:08 p.m. by neighbor Carol Williams, who waved from her garden. Carol would later tell police that Maggie had rolled down her window to compliment the spring flowers blooming in the front yard. After that moment, Maggie Foster vanished into her house. What happened in the hours that followed would defy explanation and haunt investigators for years to come. Margaret Foster's sister, Linda, made the discovery that would change everything. When Maggie didn't answer her usual 7 a.m. phone call on Tuesday morning, Linda initially wasn't worried. Maybe her sister had overslept or was in the shower. But when the second call went unanswered, Linda felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. Maggie never missed our morning calls, Linda would later tell investigators. Never. Not even when she had the flu last winter. Something was wrong. By 8:30 a.m., Linda was standing on her sister's front porch, peering through windows and calling Maggie's name. The front door was locked, but Linda knew about the spare key hidden under the ceramic frog by the back steps. She'd teased Maggie about that hiding spot for years, saying it was too obvious. Linda opened the back door and called out, "Maggie, are you okay?" The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the grandfather clock in the living room. Everything looked normal. Dishes washed and put away, mail sorted on the kitchen counter, Tuesday's clothes laid out on the bedroom chair. Then Linda walked into the living room. The scream that erupted from her throat brought neighbors running from 3 houses away. Carol Williams found Linda on the front lawn, hyperventilating and pointing toward the house. "Call 911, Linda gasped. "Call them now. Something terrible. Oh God, what did they do to her?" Inside, investigators found a scene that defied comprehension. The violence was so extreme, so unnecessarily brutal, that even the medical examiner struggled to determine exactly what had happened. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. This was something else entirely. The question that haunted everyone was simple yet impossible to answer. What kind of person could do this to gentle Maggie Foster? Detective Martinez stood in the middle of Maggie Foster's living room, surrounded by evidence that made no sense. The house showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing valuable was missing. Maggie's purse sat untouched on the kitchen counter, containing $140 in cash and credit cards. Her jewelry box upstairs remained undisturbed. The medical examiner's preliminary findings only deepened the mystery. "The level of violence is unprecedented," Dr. Richard Hayes told Martinez. "But here's what's strange. There's no evidence of sexual assault, no defensive wounds on her hands, no signs that she fought back. It's as if she was completely surprised by the attack." Martinez and her team began the methodical process of investigating everyone in Maggie's life. They started with the obvious suspects: recent parolees in the area, registered sex offenders, anyone with a history of violence against women. Every lead came up empty. Maggie didn't have enemies. Her sister Linda insisted during her interview. She was the kind of person who apologized when other people bumped into her. She once cried because she accidentally stepped on a spider. The investigation expanded to include Maggie's workplace. Could a disgruntled parent have blamed her for something? Had she witnessed inappropriate behavior and planned to report it? Principal Coleman was adamant that nothing unusual had occurred at the school. Financial records revealed no irregularities. Maggie lived modestly on her librarian's salary, had no debts beyond her mortgage, and kept meticulous records of every expense. Her phone record showed calls to family, a few local businesses, and the veterinarian about her foster cat's upcoming surgery. By the end of the first week, investigators had interviewed 47 people and followed up on dozens of tips. They had no suspects, no clear motive, and no explanation for the savage brutality that had ended Maggie Foster's quiet life. As news of the brutal murder spread through the small town of Cedar Falls, theories began to multiply like weeds after rain. Everyone had an opinion about who could have committed such a horrific crime, and police found themselves chasing shadows down every dead-end street. The first major lead came from Maggie's neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who reported seeing an unfamiliar van parked on Elmwood Drive the evening before the murder. "It was dark blue or black," she told Detective Martinez. The man inside was watching Maggie's house through binoculars. When pressed for details, Mrs. Henderson's description became vague and contradictory. Police spent 3 days tracking down every dark van in a 30-mile radius. They found 17 vehicles matching the description, interviewed their owners, and verified alibis. Not one led anywhere meaningful. Mrs. Henderson, they discovered, had been prescribed new medication for her glaucoma and admitted her vision had been fuzzy recently. Then came the revelation about Maggie's past. During a deep dive into her personal history, investigators uncovered a relationship from 15 years earlier that had ended badly. Robert Chen, now living 2 states away, had once filed a restraining order against Maggie after their breakup, claiming she'd been stalking him. It was completely out of character for her, Linda told investigators. Maggie was heartbroken when Robert ended things. But stalking, that's not who she was. Still, police had to follow the lead. Chen's alibi was solid. He'd been in a business meeting with 12 witnesses when Maggie was killed. The most promising suspect emerged when investigators learned about James Morrison, a drifter who'd been working odd jobs around Cedar Falls for the past month. Morrison had a history of violence against women and had been seen in the grocery store the same afternoon as Maggie. 2 witnesses claimed he'd been watching her while she shopped. Police tracked Morrison to a homeless camp outside town, where they found him drunk and belligerent. During questioning, he made several inconsistent statements about his whereabouts Monday evening. But DNA evidence collected from the scene excluded him completely, and surveillance footage from a gas station showed him 20 miles away during the time frame of the murder. Each false lead was more frustrating than the last, and the media pressure was becoming unbearable. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Maggie Foster's own dedication to helping others. 3 weeks into the investigation, Detective Martinez received a call from Dr. Patricia Wells, a forensic psychologist who'd been following the case in the media. "I think you're looking at this wrong," Dr. Wells told Martinez. "The extreme violence, the lack of obvious motive, the absence of defensive wounds. This feels personal, but not romantically personal. This feels like someone who blamed Maggie for something catastrophic in their life." Dr. Wells's insight prompted Martinez to revisit all of Maggie's interactions at the school. They'd already interviewed teachers, parents, and students. But what about former connections? What about someone whose life had intersected with Maggie's years ago? The answer came from an unlikely source: the school's old employee files. Buried in a box of records from 5 years earlier was a termination letter for Kevin Walsh, a janitor who'd been fired after accusations of inappropriate behavior toward female staff members. The complaint had been filed by Margaret Foster. Walsh had worked at Roosevelt Elementary for 3 years before Maggie reported that he'd been making unwanted advances toward her and other women. Her detailed complaint described how Walsh would follow female employees to their cars, make inappropriate comments, and once cornered Maggie in the library after hours. She was terrified, Principal Coleman recalled when Martinez showed her the file. Walsh became increasingly aggressive after we started investigating. He blamed Maggie for ruining his reputation, said she'd regret making up lies about him. Walsh had left town after his termination, but DMV records showed he'd returned to Cedar Falls just 2 weeks before Maggie's murder. He'd been living in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, paying cash for his room and keeping a low profile. When police tracked down Walsh's room, they found newspaper clippings about Maggie's death, along with detailed notes about her daily routine that went back months. Kevin Walsh didn't run when police arrived at his motel room. He sat calmly on the edge of the bed, as if he'd been expecting them. When Detective Martinez read him his rights, Walsh's only response was, "She had it coming." During interrogation, Walsh revealed a level of planning that chilled investigators to the bone. He'd been watching Maggie for months, studying her schedule, learning her habits, and nurturing a rage that had festered for 5 years. In his twisted mind, Maggie Foster had destroyed his life by reporting his behavior at the school. "She turned everyone against me," Walsh told Martinez, his voice flat and emotionless. "Made them think I was some kind of predator. I lost my job, my reputation, my place in this community. All because some uptight librarian couldn't take a compliment." Walsh described the evening of the murder with disturbing clarity. He'd waited until dark, then used his knowledge of Maggie's routine to approach her house from the back alley. He knew she often left her back door unlocked when she was expecting a delivery or had laundry hanging on the line. "She was surprised to see me," Walsh continued. "Started backing away, reaching for her phone. That's when I knew she still thought she was better than me, still thought she could control what happened." The brutality of the attack, Walsh explained, wasn't random. It was punishment. In his deranged thinking, Maggie deserved to suffer for the years of humiliation and unemployment he'd endured after his termination. The extreme violence was his way of making her pay for what he saw as the destruction of his life. What horrified investigators most was Walsh's complete lack of remorse. He showed no recognition that his behavior at the school had been inappropriate, no understanding that Maggie had been protecting herself and her colleagues. In his mind, he was the victim seeking justice. Even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend how 5 years of resentment could transform into such calculated, savage brutality. The trial of Kevin Walsh began 6 months later in a courthouse packed with community members, media representatives, and Maggie Foster's grieving family. The case had captured regional attention, not just for its brutality, but for the disturbing insight it provided into how workplace harassment could escalate into deadly violence. Prosecutor Jennifer Chen methodically presented the evidence: the newspaper clippings found in Walsh's room, the detailed surveillance notes, his confession, and the DNA evidence that placed him at the scene. This wasn't a crime of passion, Chen told the jury. This was a calculated act of revenge by a man who spent 5 years planning the murder of an innocent woman whose only crime was reporting his inappropriate behavior. The prosecution called Dr. Patricia Wells to explain the psychology behind Walsh's actions. Mr. Walsh exhibits classic signs of narcissistic personality disorder combined with paranoid ideation, Dr. Wells testified. He was unable to accept responsibility for his actions at the school, instead creating an elaborate fantasy where Ms. Foster was the villain who destroyed his life. Walsh's defense attorney, Michael Rodriguez, faced an almost impossible task. His client had confessed to the murder and shown no remorse. Rodriguez's strategy was to argue that Walsh suffered from mental illness that had been exacerbated by years of unemployment and social isolation. Kevin Walsh is not a monster, Rodriguez told the jury. He's a sick man whose untreated mental illness transformed workplace rejection into deadly obsession. While his actions are inexcusable, we must consider the role that mental health played in this tragedy. The defense presented testimony from a psychiatrist who diagnosed Walsh with severe depression and paranoid personality disorder. They argued that Walsh's perception of reality had become so distorted that he genuinely believed Maggie Foster had intentionally destroyed his life. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They presented evidence of Walsh's methodical planning, his ability to hold jobs in other cities after leaving Cedar Falls, and his calculated approach to stalking Maggie. Mental illness doesn't explain this level of premeditation, Chen argued. This was revenge, pure and simple. The most powerful moment came when Maggie's sister Linda addressed the court. "My sister died because she had the courage to speak up about inappropriate behavior," Linda said through tears. "She died because she tried to protect herself and other women from a man who refused to accept that his actions had consequences." The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder. Kevin Walsh was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, bringing legal closure to a case that had haunted Cedar Falls for nearly a year. But for Maggie Foster's family and friends, the end of the trial marked the beginning of a different kind of struggle. How do you make sense of such senseless violence? How do you find peace when someone you love died simply because they tried to protect themselves? The hardest part is knowing that Maggie died because she did the right thing, her sister Linda reflected months after the sentencing. She reported Kevin's behavior because she was brave enough to speak up. That courage cost her everything. The case prompted changes at Roosevelt Elementary and schools throughout the district. New policies were implemented for handling workplace harassment complaints, security was increased, and staff received training on recognizing warning signs of escalating behavior. Dr. Patricia Wells, the forensic psychologist who helped crack the case, used it as an example in her research on workplace violence. The Walsh case demonstrates how quickly professional rejection can transform into personal vendetta for certain personality types, she wrote. It's a reminder that we must take all harassment complaints seriously, not just for immediate safety, but for long-term protection. The town of Cedar Falls struggled to understand how someone could harbor such deadly resentment for 5 years. Walsh had lived among them, worked in their community, and nursed his rage while appearing to function normally. It was a chilling reminder that dangerous obsession could hide behind the most ordinary facades. Perhaps most disturbing was the randomness of Maggie's fate. She'd done everything right, reported inappropriate behavior through proper channels, followed workplace protocols, and tried to protect herself and her colleagues. Her reward was to become the target of a twisted revenge fantasy that culminated in unthinkable violence. Today, a small memorial garden blooms behind Roosevelt Elementary, planted in Maggie Foster's memory. Children read there during lunch, surrounded by flowers that symbolize the beauty and generosity she brought to their lives. It's a peaceful place, far removed from the brutality that ended her story, a reminder that even in the face of inexplicable evil, love and kindness can still take root and grow.